مرحبا بالجميع، حياكم الله واهلا وسهلا بكم في هذه
Hello,
الجلسة
everyone, and
المستضيف
welcome to this
فيها
session
القائد
in which
المركزي
we are honored to
الأستاذ
host the
أحمد
governor
غالب
of the Central
المعبقي
Bank of Yemen, Ahmed Ghaleb Al-Maabaqi,
وخالد منصر وهو خبير في مركز
this
صنعاء.
as well as another panelist, Khaled
طبعا
Mansour,
الجلسة
an
بتكون
economic
لمدة
and financial
ساعة
expert at the Sana'a
وسيكون
Center. This will
متزمة
be an hour-long
متزمة
session during which
بالإنجليزية،
simultaneous
وسيكون المتحدث
interpretation
باللغة
in both
العربية
Arabic and English will
والتسجيل
be
الذكي
available. Most of
بإمكانكم
the session will be
استخدام
conducted in Arabic,
رمز الكرة
and you
لتغيير
can
اللغة.
use the globe
أيضا
icon to
بتكون
select the channel that you would
الجلسة
like to listen
لايف
to.
عبر
This
المنصات
session will
مواقع
also
التواصل
be
الاجتماعي.
broadcast live through our social
يمكنكم
media
أيضا
platforms and
التواصل
accounts.
معكم عبر
You can
الحجاب.
use the question and answer box to ask your questions
وبعد أعتقد 40 دقيقة أو
throughout the
نصف
discussion.
دقيقة
And
أعتقد
in
أن
40
الجلسة
minutes, or
هي
possibly
منتهية
in
من
the second
السماء
half of the
بمنزلة
session,
العمليات في مركز صنعاء.
we will have a
ستكون
period for questions and answers
ستمنحكم
as well.
فرصة
Nuha will,
للمشاركة.
at the Chief
الميكروفون لك
Operations
أستاذة
Officer at the
نهى.
Sana'a Center, will be facilitating this session.
شكرا
Over to you,
جزيلا
Nuha.
مراد وأهلا
Thank you very
وسهلا
much,
جميعا.
Murad. Welcome, everyone.
جلستنا اليوم هي حول
Our
تداعيات
session
التصنيف
today
والعقوبات
is
المالية
on
الأمريكية
the
على القطاع
impact of the
المصرفي.
US FTO
يشرفني
designation and financial
أن
sanctions on
يكون معنا
Yemen's banking
اليوم
sector. I'm
معالي
honored
الأخ
to
الأستاذ
host
أحمد
His
غالب
Excellency Ahmed Ghaleb,
رئيس البنك المركزي
the governor
اليمني
of the Central Bank of Yemen,
والأستاذ خالد منصر
and Khaled Mansour,
خبير اقتصادي
who
لدى
is an
مركز صنعاء.
economic expert at the Sana'a Center.
بعد عودة الرئيس الأمريكي دونالد ترامب إلى البيت
After the
الأبيض في
return
يناير
of President
الماضي أعاد
Trump
رسميا تصنيف جماعة الحوثيين
to the
كمنظمة إرهابية
presidency
أجنبية،
in
معتبرا
January
أن
of
أنشطة الحوثي تهدد أمن
2025, he
المدنيين
designated the
والجنود
Houthis,
الأمريكيين في
considering
الشرق
that
الأوسط
the
وتضرر
activities
استقرار
of the
شركاء الولايات
Houthis
المتحدة
threatened
الإقليميين
American
وأمن
interests
التجارة
and
البحرية
troops in the
العالمي.
region, as well as
وفي
posing
هذا
a threat
السياق يهدف
to
مركز
international
صنعاء
commercial
للدراسات
shipping. In this
في هذه
context,
الجلسة الافتراضية إلى
the Sana'a
تسليط الضوء
Center
على
aims during
التحديات
this
الملحة
virtual
التي تواجه
or
البنوك
virtual
اليمنية
webinar
في ظل
to
هذا
discuss the
التصنيف
challenges that
وما
Yemeni
يصاحبه
banks
من
face
عقوبات مالية.
in light of this designation
سنناقش في
and
هذه
the
الجلسة
accompanying
التصنيف
financial
الحالي،
sanctions. During this session, we will discuss the
هل هو
FTO
أثر
designation,
إيجابي أم سلبي
whether it has
للمصراف
had a
اليمني،
positive
ما
or
هو
negative
تأثير
impact on the
أو
Yemeni
أثر هذه
context,
الإجراءات على
what
المواطن اليمني،
impact do
وبصورة
these
أوسع ما هو
measures have
التأثير
on
على
Yemeni
فكرة القطاع
civilians, and
المصرفي
more
اليمني على
broadly,
الوصول إلى
what
الأسواق
impact does it
المالية
have on
الدولية
the Yemeni
وعلى
banking
مدى
sector's
انفتاحه
ability to
للمحفظة
access
العالمية.
international banking
آه، قبل أن
and
نبدأ
its ability to be compliant
الجلسة
with standards
بالأسئلة
and
الأكثر
regulations.
اتجاهية، ممكن
Before
أستاذ
starting the
أحمد
questions,
لو
with
ممكن
some of the more
تجيب
technical
لنا
questions, I would
خلفية
like to
سريعة
ask
عن
Mr.
الوضع
Ahmed
الاقتصادي الحالي
Ghaleb to
بشكل
give
عام
us a brief
والراهن
overview
له
of the economic
سبب
situation,
انهيارها
the
وبعد
currency, the
المهاوشات.
reason for its
شكرا
its loss
جزيلا
of value,
للجميع واهلا
and
وسهلا بكم
any other
جميعا
background information. Thank you very much,
ومساء
Noha, and
الخير
welcome
للبعض
everyone.
وصباح الخير
Good
للبعض الآخر
afternoon or good morning,
طالما الجلسة
depending on where you are.
بالزوم. وشكرا لمركز صنعاء على
I would like to thank the
الاستضافة.
Sana'a Center for this opportunity.
بداية يعني
First
وضع
and
النظام
foremost,
المصرفي
the
قبل
state
التصنيف غير
of the banking
optimistic.
sector, even before the designation, was
فمنذ
not
الحرب
an optimistic one. Since the beginning of the war
انقلاب الجماعة الحوثية على
and the
كل
coup
الطوائف
by the
السابقة
Houthi militias against all of the
تم
national
انقسام
level of agreements
المؤسسات
that were reached before,
وليس انقسام فقط بل
this
تعارض في
coup
السياسات.
and the war led to a fragmentation in institutions, and not just a fragmentation in these institutions, but also for them to start adopting conflicting policies and measures. And this behavior further complicated the situation, leading to difficulties in carrying out transactions, whether inside Yemen as local transactions or international ones. The situation also got worse with the Houthis banning the use of newly printed banknotes and imposing an unrealistic exchange rate for the older banknotes. This complicated even internal transfers and led practically to the creation of two separate economies, as if we are living in two states and with two separate economies, with the currency having one value in one area and the same currency having a different value in the other areas. Another important part of the context that has further complicated things for the banking sector is the confiscation of the assets and accounts of opposition figures. This led to the banking sector coming under the illegal domination of the group, and one that it was very clear that it was not well thought out. This led to many people being unable to access their funds. And worse than that, they issued the law banning the use of interest. And this has practically destroyed commercial banks, the traditional banks in Yemen. as their deposits, which were receiving small interest payments that weren't even paid out, but were only registered or logged in the records. But at least the banks were able to use some of their new deposits to pay out small interest payments to depositors and account holders, which would help them live at the bare minimum, especially in a country where salaries have not been paid regularly over the past 10 years. And also at the same time, this occurred in parallel with a decrease in funding and from donors to Yemen, and the group taking control or dominating this assistance and the aid. And proof of that is that is the fact that many of the assistance and aid workers in the areas under the control are being imprisoned. This aid was being used to recruit and mobilize fighters and to fuel their war machine. All of these developments complicated the banking environment for Yemeni banks, in addition to the conflicting measures and policies by the fragmented institutions, which further complicated transactions with the outside world. We were able to reopen the central bank's accounts that had been frozen. We were, after lengthy effort, were able to have these accounts unfrozen with the support of our partners and the international community. All of these factors have also definitely impacted the the situation of the Yemeni economy, and especially after the targeting of Yemeni oil export facilities and forcing trade to pass through Hodeidah port. Around 70 to 80% of state revenue was lost due to the targeting of oil and gas export terminals, leading to the situation becoming even more difficult. We lost around 7 to 8 billion US dollars that was not reimbursed or compensated by our neighboring partners. They only provided 1.2 billion US dollars, and this is a significant deficit. And the aid that was being provided in April 2022 was additional assistance that was provided to the Yemeni government at a time when oil was still being exported and while fuel grants were still being provided to the Yemeni government by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But now the situation is a catastrophe. People have not been paid their salaries in April and May. Today, civil servants are owed the salaries for June. And there were also some very important religious special occasions and holidays at the time that people were unable to cover the costs of, with the continued devaluation of the currency, with the continued rising costs and prices due to the increase in insurance and shipping due to the events in the incidents in the Red Sea, in addition to the non-payment of salaries. I think that leads to a very difficult picture to imagine. And so in brief, this is the economic situation. I'm lucky here that we still have electricity here in the office, but for most people in Aden, a city where the temperature goes up to 38 or 40 degrees Celsius, they get maybe 2 hours of electricity and then an outage for 7 or 8 hours. And I think this shows you and gives you a clear overview of the disastrous situation that we are living through in light of these ongoing developments, all of which were caused by the coup in 2015 by the Houthis. They violated all of the agreements that had been reached at the national level and led to this ongoing war, a war that has only expanded since then to the regional and international sphere. And unfortunately, it is difficult to be optimistic with recent developments. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I think this is an excellent entry point to our next question. It's now been 5 months after the US designated the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. How has this designation and the accompanying sanctions affected the banking sector's ability to deliver financial services? You spoke about the impact that it had. You said that it had an impact even at the level of the central bank, but could you give us a broader view of the impact of this designation on the banking sector, especially when it comes to transfers and remittances, which are, due to the lack of oil being exported, are one of the main sources of revenue or income for people? In general, So this is not misunderstood. We at the central bank believe that the designation of the Houthis is a positive development for the banking sector and a way to help rebalance the situation and help the banking sector escape the illegal and irrational measures that are being imposed on it. After the special designation of the Houthis last year, we tried to protect the banking sector, and we made the decision for this sector to move to Aden. And we made this very clear. Our position is clear. We are not a part of the economic war between the two sides. Our objective is to protect the banking sector. We do not want to further escalate or carry out any offensives. We just want to protect the banking sector and ensure that Yemenis in all parts of the country can smoothly carry out their transactions and activities. We believe that we are responsible for all Yemeni civilians from Sa'ada to Al-Mahra, and we want to facilitate the economic and financial access for them. Unfortunately, that was not to be, with the decision for the banks to move to Aden. And then the designation came to be, which helped us achieve it by other means. And at the central bank, despite the difficulties and despite the impact that it will have, we still believe overall that the positives of the designation far outweigh its negatives. The designation will have both internal and external impacts. One of the impacts is that two major banks in Yemen were designated or sanctioned. One of the banks was sanctioned before the announcement of the FTO as a result of it carrying out illegal and illicit activities. And this was one of the major banks in Yemen, and one that was very successful. And the other bank was sanctioned after the FTO designation as a result of it not adhering to the procedures required by the FTO, which is to end transactions or activities and to move their headquarters out of Houthi-controlled areas. But for the rest of the banks, they shifted their headquarters. Some of the banks have completed these measures and were given a document to certify that they've moved their headquarters. And there are also banks that have moved their headquarters, so their boards of directors, the SWIFT, their connection to the SWIFT network, their databases, their compliance departments. And so all of the basics or all of the core parts were moved, and what remains are some smaller scale issues that could be completed within the areas under the control of the legitimate government. And the very lengthy Eid break, which was around 12 or 13 days, if it weren't for that, we would have completed these measures, as we only grant the document certifying that the banks have moved their headquarters and have met all requirements until after a technical team from all of the departments of the central bank, from our IT department, from the SWIFT department, from the banking supervision department, conduct a field visit and ensure that the 8 conditions that were handed over to the bank, which were also agreed to with our international partners, had been met by the banks in order for the certification to be granted. Some banks have completed their move. Some banks will be getting the certification soon, while others chose to voluntarily liquidate their position. And this includes the branches of external or non-Yemeni banks. And these banks had stopped their activities even before the FTO, moving their activities to their headquarters. And their activities, they only have one branch in Sana'a and one branch in Aden, because there are significant deposits that had been made by the state as well as by civilians, and they would need to liquidate or settle them based on the legal procedures in place. There is still a single bank that has to complete a single legal procedure, and hopefully within the coming period, all of these procedures will be completed. And so all banks would have moved their headquarters and cut off all of their ties, including the link to the network with the central bank branch in Sana'a and with the Houthis. These banks have also made written commitments that they will not accept any instructions from any entity other than the central bank in Aden. And so this is with regards to the banks that have moved all of their headquarters and departments, but continue to operate branches. We had a discussion with our partners at the U.S. Department of Treasury, because we're now dealing with more than 50% of the population residing in those areas, and they would need to have access to the international banking system. There are transfers like remittances from expats that go to this part of the country, the part that is still under the control of the Houthis. And there will need to be a legal mechanism for the transfers to be made to these people. Otherwise, they will all make these transfers through the informal transfer system. And so this is based on the discussions, and that it could be added as a part of the general licensing or the general licenses that were added to the FTO. But that they would need to be done through a third party. We were given a list of international companies by the Department of Treasury that have expertise in dealing with these kinds of contexts that are similar to the situation in our country. And now many banks have started to have contracted with one of these companies, K2. And today there was the Banking Association, after all of the banks had been moved to Aden and all of their activities, we had to move the Banking Association from Sana'a to Aden as well, especially after its term had ended. And so the Banking Association was restructured, and it included banks that had been established after the formation of the previous board of the association. And today we had a meeting in which the Central Bank and the Banking Association, as well as a number of commercial banks, met with this international firm, K2, so that it could play the role of the third-party monitor of transactions, whether these are cross-border transactions or transactions between the Aden and the rest of the governorates. We've done everything we can, whether through technical assistance or consultation, or even opening channels of communication with these banks, with OFAC and with the U.S. Department of Treasury. Many of the banks have been able to go to DC to meet with officials there, and communication between us and the Department of Treasury and the banks is ongoing. We also had a joint meeting with the Central Bank and the Department of Treasury and the banking sector, and a large number of the major money transfer companies and some actors in the private sector. And this is what we've been working on in the previous period. Thank you very much. But I just wanted to add, Noha, that for each one, especially since in Yemen, we had been under increased monitoring or oversight until 2014. In 2014, we were able to move beyond this, and the only thing that remained was a field visit by the the FATF, and we would have been able to have gone back to a less severe category with oversight or an inspection every 2 years. But unfortunately, the war started, and the team from FATF was unable to conduct the visit, and so we were returned once again to the grey list. This has an impact on the transactions that we can carry out with the international banking system. We had tried to encourage many of the banks that have strong compliance and to ensure that the financial auctions would be transferred to these banks through the Federal Reserve. And I think we've made some steps. The designation will help make some of the banks hesitant. Some of the banks had started to close their accounts, but we intervened and we told them that these banks are now moving to Aden and they're now under the supervision of the Central Bank. And we called the whole world in. Asking them to implement what was declared in the designation that these sanctions and the designation target the Houthis and not the Yemeni people. And so that is what we ask for you, to work with us in oversight and supervision of all transactions, and we don't have any problems with that. We're open to everyone. And so this approach has helped us restore or unfreeze many of the accounts. But even with that, like I've said, all of the accounts and all of the transactions would have to go through the third party. And the third party is the company that we've started these discussions with and started contracting. And I consider that to be a positive development. First, because it helps protect the banking sector, especially since many of the criteria and requirements might be unclear and questions that have not been answered. And one of the services provided by this company is that it helps improve the performance of these banks while improving their compliance, and helps deal with many of the gaps that might be overlooked, and also helps give them advice about certain transfers, whether they are low or high risk transfers or transactions. And I think that this will be very beneficial for the banks so that they can help improve their operations, which will help open the door for further transactions and activities with corresponding banks, and help expand their network of corresponding banks abroad. Thank you very much, Ahmed. If you'd allow me to continue, as this is an idea that's linked to what you were just saying. As far as I understood, we now have a company, the third-party company, that helps vet transactions. But when it comes to coordination with other entities, because I think we've heard a lot about what's being done, but corresponding banks now might not worry about that. They might just think that Yemen as a whole is more of a risk, and just seeing Yemen on a transfer might lead to high risk. Is there any coordination with the Department of Treasury, with the IMF? We spoke about FATF and MENA FATF, but the IMF, the World Bank, corresponding banks in general, has there been work or coordination with them to help alleviate any of the negative impacts? The main coordination that we have is with the Treasury and with OFAC, and they're the ones who are helping us with this. With regards to the corresponding banks, when they receive a certificate that this bank has been certified by the Central Bank and that this bank has met all of the requirements and has moved all of their operations under the supervision of the Central Bank, and has contracted a qualified third party that was nominated by the Department of Treasury to vet transactions, whether inside Yemen, from the bank headquarters to their branches in the Houthi areas. And this is only allowed based on the transactions that were included in the general licenses and the FTO announcement. We've received many questions from the banks on what the transactions what measures they would need to implement, and we're trying to help walk them through this process. And we continue with this communication and coordination to ensure that everything is as clear and transparent as possible. And so I believe that in the coming period, or in the past period, sorry, we've received significant support from the Department of Treasury, from OFAC, and from many of the corresponding banks, and we hope that this coordination and cooperation continues, and that it is strengthened, especially after all of the banks have contracted the third party that will carry out auditing and vetting of all transactions, whether incoming or outgoing, or those between the areas under the control of the government and the areas that are under the control of the Houthis. Thank you very much, Ahmed. We'll come back to you with another question. I'll come back to you with the questions, but I would like to ask Khaled for an intervention first. You mentioned that you've gone back, you tried to learn from other contexts that had similar experiences. And so the question that comes to mind, especially to the mind of Yemenis, other countries have been designated, whether Iran or many other examples exist. And so do you believe that there will be a positive impact possibly from the designation? You said at the beginning that the central bank supported the designation, but I wanted to hear more from you about what difference would there be when it comes to Yemen. Is that a question for me or for Khaled? No, that's a question for you, but I was going to ask a question for Khaled. I was saying that after we explained the topic to our colleagues, to our partners in the Department of Treasury and the OFAC, that the situation in Yemen, with a large percentage of the population continuing to reside in those areas, and especially with a disastrous humanitarian crisis in the country, these remittances are important. And they help ensure that there continues to be some sort of food security, and these remittances are also an important source when it comes to financing imports and the balance of payments. And so that was the proposal, that bank branches could continue providing services that are permitted within the general licenses in the areas under the control of the Houthis, but we would also like to benefit from similar contexts. And that's where the idea of a third party came in, of having a third party firm or entity to vet all transactions. There are other experiences, like you mentioned, Iraq, Iran. But the clear one that also applies to our case is the case of Palestine. Palestine, the Gaza Strip was like the situation in Sana'a, and Aden is like Ramallah. But the difference is that they might even be a bit more rational in Gaza. They don't try to get involved in banking issues and affect the banking system of the country as a whole. But our situation is different. The Houthis want to get involved and interfere in everything, even interfering in the banks that had been established after the war in Aden and don't even have any branches in Sana'a. And so I think that is the closest or most similar case. There are banks in Ramallah that have branches in Gaza, and they carry out transfers, and there's a third party that monitors and vets these transactions. These transactions are given to individuals. They are not given to any designated individuals or entities. And this helps ensure that financial flows continue smoothly. And that remittances can be made from expats to their relatives in the country. And this is the main source now of income for many Yemenis around the country. Poverty rates in Yemen have gone up past 80% based on statistics from the World Bank. And I think even that is underrating the reality of it. Thank you very much, Ahmed. Khaled, if I could go back to you with the question on the challenges facing the banking sector. What are the main challenges, if you could please share with us, for banks continuing to provide financial services, especially in light of the financial fragmentation? And what are the risks of designation? Thank you very much, Noha, and thank you, Ahmed. I think Ahmed has covered a major part of the challenges facing the banking sector. He's mentioned that the banking sector had already been dealing with many of these problems even before the designation, and even before the economic and banking fragmentation. But I might be able to mention some points that I believe are the main challenges facing banks. And the first is that the banks that had been the bank accounts that or deposits that had been made in the central bank had been frozen. They make up 70 to 80% of bank deposits or assets. Banks invested in treasury bonds around $1.8 trillion Yemeni riyals, and this money these funds have been suspended or frozen. And this is one of the major challenges facing banks. With regards to the designation and sanctions, the FTO, American designations of groups, will designate a group within a state. But the situation in Yemen might be a bit more complicated. And Ahmed mentioned the similarity of the context and Palestine. But I think our situation is even more complicated than Palestine, because the group that has been designated as a terrorist group in Gaza governed Gaza, but that was not the capital or the headquarters of the Palestinian Authority. But the problem in Yemen is that the group that has been designated is the group in control of the capital Sana'a and other important governorates. And the governance in Yemen was extremely centralized, and so all state institutions are in Sana'a, as well as 70% of the population residing in that and surrounding governorates. Most of the private sector even is in Sana'a, including banks. All of the banks have their headquarters in Sana'a, with the exception of a single bank, which was established before Yemeni unification, which is Al Ahli Bank, and it is headquartered in Aden. And so the situation in Yemen is more complicated, and banks and the banking sector, which is a very sensitive sector when it comes to designations or sanctions, due to the fact that this sector needs a link to the international banking system to function. One of the obstacles imposed by the sanctions is that the banks have found themselves having to move to try to find other headquarters, because this group has been designated as in control of all state institutions, and it is not a group that banks can remain there while choosing to not work with. And so this requirement of moving to Aden has led to many complications and problems, because most of the main clients of these banks also operate out of the areas that are under the control of the Houthis. And even the banks that have taken initiative and moved to the areas under the control of the government are facing a severe liquidity crisis in their branches. And with all of the steps that the central bank is taking in their communication with the Department of Treasury and helping link them to the private sector and the commercial banks, at the end of the day, corresponding banks will make a decision based on the amount of transactions to Yemen, and they'll find that these transactions or the revenue from them is not significant, and so it is not worth the risk. And this requires significant effort for Yemeni banks to maintain their ties with corresponding banks due to this increased level of risk. In addition to the fact that most of the bank assets had been frozen in treasury bonds and the central bank, the move from Sana'a to Aden has added additional burdens and costs. So, for example, the necessity of establishing new data centers, because they were unable to move the data centers that had been based in Sana'a. They also have problems in moving their staff. There are threats facing the staff that had been in Sana'a, and some of them have difficulties moving, and some of them, because they aren't able to go back to Sana'a, have if they leave, and have refused to move. And so this will lead to further lack of qualified staff who will be able to operate the new banking headquarters in Aden. Thank you very much, Khaled. Yes, go ahead, Ahmed. If you'll allow me, I just had a quick comment on Khaled's intervention. I agree with all of the points that he mentioned. The public debt, service payments on public debt or interest payments stopped in 2015, and so banks are facing difficulties, and depositors in general are suffering because of this. People, those who have 800 million, for example, in deposits will get 100,000 a month, which is not sufficient. Some of them die because they're unable to treat illnesses, for example, because they're unable to access their deposits. Some of them have what might be millions in life savings or even smaller amounts. What has also made the situation worse is that the Houthis, in their decision to prohibit interest payments, have imposed this or have transferred these funds to current accounts that still are not accessible. This 1.8 trillion, it was around $8 billion in value in the past, but now with the devaluation of the currency, it has no value, and so it's significant losses for depositors, and banks continue to be under the domination of the Houthis, and with the continued loss of value of the currency, as well as the unfair or unjust levies that are being imposed on any economic activities, and with many private sector firms being closed, I think people had reached a point where they were in very dire straits. The opportunity that was given by the central bank was a way out for banks to help escape these practices. But unfortunately, this was not achieved last year when the banks were requested to move. It's true that the banks face significant problems, but the decision that was made last year, these decisions came at a time when we were very close to reaching an agreement with the banks on them moving, and they had already made significant steps. Some banks have their databases outside Yemen, and some of them have the databases in the governorate, and some of them have their own cloud systems. And even with regards to the connection to the SWIFT network, they have many tokens that are distributed to many different areas. But the bank staff was one of the biggest problems. But since the special designation of the Houthis, some of the banks, due to the fact that they were also in contact with American experts and lawyers, they knew that the FTO designation of the Houthis was coming. And so many of their staff left either through Jordan or Saudi Arabia, or even by traveling directly to the areas. There was one single bank that delayed its move significantly and took all of their staff and administration on a bus, and they were captured trying to leave the areas under the control of the Houthis. But then the Sana'a realized that these banks have no choice. They either die and go bankrupt, or they try to live on the bare minimum, only providing their service by providing their services to Yemenis in all parts of the country, and they will benefit from that. So there are problems with staffing, like Khaled said, but there are banks that have been able to bring their staff. And I think at the end of the day, even if there is no sufficient staff, we can train the staff that is needed. And the private sector has sufficient flexibility to get the necessary staff and to continue its operations. But the most important thing is that the banking sector will be able to carry out their operations in an environment that is safe and one that is free of repression, terrorism, and persecution, and that the banks will be able to carry out their operations in accordance with the law. We know that the situation is not perfect, even in the areas under the control of the legitimate government. But in the areas under the control of the legitimate government, at least you have the ability to go to courts. You can appeal any decisions that you find to be unfair. Unlike the areas under the control of the Houthis, where you either do what they want or you are repressed and imprisoned. And so I think with all of this, we believe that the banking sector will be able to make up for the difficulties that it faced in the previous period, in which many of their activities were hindered and repressed. Many banks were unable to even invest. Some of the banks that have not invested in upgrading their systems, and a lot of the newly established banks have more advanced systems because the traditional banks in Yemen had not developed or progressed. They have not purchased new systems. They have not included or provided new applications. I think Yemen Kuwait Bank, which is a bank that was sanctioned, was at the forefront because it was operating here in the areas under the control of the government more than it does in other areas. And this bank had taken the initiative, was able to take risks more than with the other banks. But like you said, one of the these are challenges as well, but this is not a new challenge due to the FTO. This is a challenge due to the conflict, due to the coup by the Houthis, which have blown up the situation and gotten us to the disaster that we are in now.
شكرا جزيلا أستاذ أحمد.
Thank you very much, Ahmed.
يعني أنتم ذكرتوا نقطة مهمة جدا.
You mentioned a very important point on the exchange rate of the Yemeni riyal.
صرف أموال المساعدات.
I wanted to ask about the exchange of the Yemeni riyals of aid funding. How would you like to, how are you going to deal with the concerns that international organizations providing aid to Yemen and about the exchange rates and exchanging their funds into Yemeni riyals? I think when it comes to aid, with regards to the if It will also be subject to the same conditions and mechanism that expat remittances will be, and that are allowed under the general licenses. We have a floating exchange rate, but organizations have the choice. If the situation continues with this monetary fragmentation and with newly printed banknotes still not being allowed to be used in Sana'a, because we have an unrealistic exchange rate in Sana'a and a different one in Aden. And I think some organizations might want to use US dollars or Saudi riyals or any other foreign currency to ensure that beneficiaries receive these disbursements. And I don't think there will be a problem with them as long as all of these mechanisms and procedures adhere to the general licenses and are done in coordination with the central bank and other supervisory entities. Thank you very much, Ahmed. With regards to the difference in the position, so on one hand, we have the FTO designation being imposed on the Houthis, but on the other hand, we also have assistance or aid and projects supporting different institutions, including the central bank, being stopped. There was a project that was being supported by USAID and the government of the United Kingdom, which helped build the capacity for compliance in the banking sector. Could you please share with us more what impact this assistance being cut off had? Because this assistance is very important for dealing with situations such as this one with the sanctions. We've received assistance, very important and needed assistance since the central bank moved to Aden and improving its performance and helping restructure many of its departments and bolstering and enhancing the bank supervision department, also in combating or countering money laundering and terrorism financing. And this was implemented by Pragma with funding from USAID and also by the United Kingdom in recent years. Unfortunately, with the decisions that were made by President Trump, USAID ceased all of its operations, and all aid was cut off, not just to Yemen, to most countries, with some very small exceptions made for special considerations. But this was a general decision that was made, and we communicated with our partners in the United States, and we explained the situation to them. Now with the FTO, the FTO has posed challenges to us, and it requires additional capacity building, requires bolstering oversight and supervision and countering money laundering and terrorism financing. And so all of the topics that were mentioned in the FTO. And so we asked for assistance to be provided. And through the United Kingdom expressed their preparedness to fund the component on countering money laundering and terrorism financing. But beyond that, we had a project with the World Bank, and this project was supposed to be presented to the board in May. And this project focuses on the payment systems, and payment systems are very important for the implementation of the FTO. We have had there has been significant progress in the applications and mechanisms that are used. It was supposed to be presented in May, but there was an objection by the United States, and we communicated with them and clarified that there were some incorrect information that this project will be implemented in the areas under the control of the Houthis, and that some of the funding will be provided to a designated group, and that the central bank will not be able to implement this project due to its size and the requirements that it has, especially taking into account the limited staffing there for implementation. At the same time, that the central bank will not be able to ensure compliance of the banking sector or the money transfer sector even after the move to Aden. But we clarified to them that this component specifically on money laundering and anti-money laundering and terrorism financing is exactly what we need. We're not going to be the implementing entity. That will be the World Bank and the UNDP. And I think we were able to convey that. And yesterday, this project was presented to the board at the World Bank and it was approved. And I hope that we can start with implementation soon. Thank you very much, Ahmed. If we could very quickly go back to the banks that moved to Aden, just to remind us, we have 8 local banks, 4 of which have moved. Have they already completed all of the procedures and have been certified? Yes, there are 3 banks. There are 3 banks that have met all of the requirements and have been certified as having moved. But the other banks, if there had not been, if not for the long Eid break, I think they would have completed their procedures as well, because cutting off the SWIFT connection, ending any transactions or dealings with the networks in Sana'a, moving their databases to Aden, and moving their staff, especially the staff working in the compliance, international operations, and SWIFT departments, as well as their board of directors. All of this was completed. But the problems that remain are linked to some legal complications that will be overcome. 2 banks were sanctioned, like I said, and 2 banks voluntarily liquidated their operations. Arab Bank, for example, has already stopped their activities and are only operating out of Aden now. And they need to deal with the account balances that remained, and also the deposits that had been made by the Yemeni state. But all of their activities had been stopped. There's still a single bank. It is, and hopefully the legal problems or complications that are being faced will be resolved in the coming days or weeks. But I reiterate that there are no banks that still operate out of Sana'a, especially when it comes to their SWIFT connections and the other core departments. All of them are now operating out of Aden, and they have all signed commitments to end all of their activities linked to the networks under the control of the Houthis. The staff that we have at the central bank is limited. Unfortunately, we weren't able to conduct field visits as quickly as we had hoped. We can do them 1 or 2 banks at a time, and hopefully we'll complete these procedures very soon and be able to resolve this problem. A significant challenge is the fact that the main clients, or the clients of the banks that had been sanctioned, especially Yemen, International Bank of Yemen. The Yemen Kuwait Bank is not a significant problem because the balances that it has in other banks and the central bank can cover the accounts of their depositors in the areas under the control of the government. And I don't think they have a problem with the in Sana'a, because they did not have much invested in treasury bonds and they were much more active. I think the bank that will be a headache for us, especially for depositors in the areas under control of the government, is IBY. We have a problem now, for example, with international organizations. They made most of their transfers through this bank, IBY, and the bank has not been able to pay out some of these transfers. Some of them were salaries, some of them were contractor payments, and these are the payments that need to be made to everyday civilians. A small contractor, for example, might have invested a lot to implement a project with UNICEF, was not paid, and he had this man tried to commit suicide and burned his vehicle in front of the UNICEF offices due to the fact that he had not gotten paid in so long. The bank is in Sana'a, its database is in Sana'a, everything is in Sana'a, and there's not much that we can do for that. Thank you very much, Ahmed. And this is linked to a question that we have here in the chat, and I would like to remind everyone that if you have any questions, or would like any clarifications, you can write them in the Q&A. And so this question is on that topic specifically about the balances that had been frozen. You mentioned IBY because of its current situation that it would be very difficult. But a bank like Yemen Kuwait Bank, which has the liquidity, will there be legal pressure to ensure that the accounts and balances that had been frozen in Sana'a will be released to depositors, or will compliance to this point be something that the bank itself has to carry out?
بنك اليمن والكويت طبعا عنده سيولة كافية.
Yemen Kuwait Bank has sufficient liquidity to cover the deposits or the balances that had been made in it by clients, and so there isn't that much of a problem there. We also had the settlement, and we've frozen the funds that they had invested in treasury bills or their accounts. And so I don't think the Yemen Kuwait Bank is settling the balances that it owes to people will not be a problem. I think IBY is currently going through bankruptcy, and another bank might take it over, or another bank might be established that has new shareholders, and if there are any problems or lack of liquidity, they'll be able to cover it. And the problem is IBY, which does not have a board of directors. Its management is in Sana'a, has remained in Sana'a, and the branch that is here in Aden has not been operational. And its obligations or commitments here in the areas under the control of the government are also significant in the bank. I can't say that we'll be able to solve all of these problems for people, because this is a much broader and more complex problem of public debt, with 1.8 to 2.2 trillion Yemeni riyals in public debt, and this is debt owed by the government. And this should be debt that does not have as much risk, but due to the ongoing conflict, the lack of resources, and the fragmentation, we are facing difficulties in covering it.
صحيح. في معنا سؤال أستاذ أحمد كمان.
We had a question from Ahmed as well that came in the chat from Hannah Porter.
بتذكر عن قلق من الاقتصاد الموازي.
And she mentions that there are concerns of a parallel economy and how this might impact the Houthis bypassing or evading sanctions, including transactions via Russia or China. And so what is your view of the parallel economy, especially since the Houthis are an informal group and are used to this? That requires all of us to cooperate, especially international actors that have the ability and the jurisdiction to follow up and gain information on these informal networks. Through the establishment of the Import Committee, we want to ensure that any goods that are imported to Yemen will be through this committee, that the financing will be done through this committee, that these importers are well known and have not been sanctioned. This is something that we've been working on for 4 months with the government, but due to the changes in the government, with the appointment of the new prime minister, things have been a bit chaotic. But with the contribution of all stakeholders, whether the banks or the money exchange companies or the chambers of commerce and industry, and the rest of the importers, all of them coming together, we were able to discuss this mechanism together. And we also benefited from something that the Houthis themselves were doing. We might have changed the name and added additional requirements based on the FTO. But I think this is something that will help control imports. It will only imports that will be allowed to come into Yemen will be through well-known importers that meet the requirements and through formal letters of credit. And I hope that we are successful in that. I know that there are many difficulties. Sometimes we find it difficult to explain even basic things to a lot of people, and also to get the necessary support to implement these plans. But at the end of the day, we will continue to do everything that we can to achieve it. And we hope that we can be supported through this. We ask for everyone's help to achieve the objective of drawing out any sources of funding for this group, a group that has harmed Yemen, the region, and the rest of the world, and to also help alleviate any difficulties that civilians face in any governorate, and not just areas under the control of the government. Our main focus are we actually focus more than the civilians in the areas under the control of the Houthis, more than the civilians here, because civilians here are free to make the decisions that they feel are best for them, but the civilians there are under a lot of repression and are going through many difficulties and suffering. There's an important question here, Ahmed, asking about the value of the currency, that the value of the currency is still fluctuating in the areas under the control of the government, unlike the areas that are under the control of the Houthis. What is the reason for this? Yes, there are many reasons for this. First, because the exchange rate in the Houthi areas is not a real exchange rate. It is one that has been imposed by force. They were helped by this because they did not have they didn't have sufficient banknotes. They had maybe 1 or 1.2 trillion Yemeni riyals in banknotes, and some of them are still in the areas under the control of the government and the central bank. And these banks should not be in circulation for more than 18 months, and it's now been more than 10 years, and so they've completely been destroyed. I think we've all seen these banknotes coming out of Sana'a, and I think many experts, UN experts, you can't even, they've seen them, and you can't even tell what banknote it is because it's been almost completely destroyed. There is no liquidity in the market there, and there is no mechanism, and the market mechanism is not allowed to operate and to show the real exchange rate based on actual economic factors. And also the division between the two banknotes, or the two, we can say, quote unquote, currencies, had led to two different economies. There's an economy that is free and that is, but with the bombing or airstrikes against the oil export facilities and the signing of the truce, the legitimate government has lost 80% of its revenues. The truce has given the Houthis an opportunity to receive imports directly through Hodeidah port, especially fuel imports. And they have also forced traders to bring in all of their imports through Hodeidah port. And so the government lost 80% of its local revenues and 65% of its external revenues with the targeting of oil export facilities, and also the strikes against gas production facilities in Marib. This led to around an 80% deficit in the public budget. Around 80% of the public budget is not funded, also due to the lack of external aid and the lack of reserves in the central bank. And even the inflationary spending that was made previously, banknotes would be printed and they would immediately be released in the market to cover government spending. And we have stopped using this inflationary spending since January of 2022. Not a single banknote has been released since then, but we've relied on our very limited external or foreign reserves, as well as funding from treasury bills and Islamic bonds, as well as from the reserves and account balances of the banks. And we've reached a point, we reached a point where we were unable to continue covering it. And like I said, we reached a point where we were unable to even cover the payment of salaries and some of the most basic items in the public budget, including provision of electricity. Sorry to interrupt you, Ahmed, but there's a very important question on the deposit guarantee scheme or institution. And so since there are no institutions, why did this institution not get involved in the liquidation of the banks? Is it under the control of the authorities of the group in Sana'a? This is one of the institutions that it would be important to move. The different committees that are now looking into it. This organization, it would be very important for it to move because the deposit guarantee, all of the banks have now moved to Aden, and so the deposit guarantee institution would need to operate out of here as well. And we hope that it can be moved to Aden as quickly as possible. And not just this institution, there are also other important state institutions that would need to move to Aden. The commercial sector institutions have also started to move to Aden due to the designation, due to the sanctions, due to the difficulty in differentiating between transactions from Aden, transactions from Sana'a, and also the fact that they are under a repressive environment in Sana'a. They've started to think more and more about moving to Aden. Some have already moved. We have many questions, and unfortunately, we're coming close to the end of our session, so we'll take 2 or 3 more questions before ending this session. Your Excellency, there was a question on the current situation in the region, especially with the ongoing war between Iran and Israel and the Houthis intervening in these regional conflicts. Might this have a direct or indirect impact on the situation in Yemen, especially since
بحسب التوافقات الحالية أو
based on the current agreement or the current and the current process that some of these banks would be allowed to have branches to continue operating in Sana'a? I think the impact will depend on the outcome of the war, of who will get involved and what will the overall impact of that conflict is. And I think that will be the best way to gauge what impact it will have on the banking sector in Yemen. But it will definitely have an impact. The whole region will change. The region is not going to stay the same after this conflict as it was before. And we hope that it has a positive impact. At the end of the day, war is always disastrous, and this disaster is going to impact everyone. But also, hopefully, we hope that it will help lead us to a path forward one way or the other. Thank you very much, Ahmed. The final 2 questions, and I'll also give you some time for any concluding remarks that you would like to make at the end of the session. There's a question here by one of the participants. He said that
سعادة المحافظ تم تصنيف بنك اليمن والكويت
Yemen Kuwait
بسبب
Bank
ممارسات
was
خاطئة.
sanctioned.
هل ممكن
You said that
توضيح ما
they
هي تلك
made some
الممارسات؟
they were involved in
وهل هناك أي
incorrect
احتمالات
or
لأي
illicit
تصنيف
practices.
جديد
Could you please
للبنوك
mention or elaborate
أو
on that?
أو
And
شركات
is there a
الصرافة خلال
possibility
الفترة
of
المقبلة؟
additional banks or money exchange companies being sanctioned in the coming period, in your opinion?
ما نقدرش أنا أقول كل
I won't be able to go into or elaborate too much on this, but there was a transaction from Iraq to Yemen and from Yemen to Lebanon, and I think that might have been the transaction that led to the sanctioning of Yemen Kuwait Bank. Well, we can't investigate, but based on our experience, OFAC only sanctions banks if there is strong evidence, and sanctions cannot be overruled by a court because there's significant evidence that provided. Maybe unlike the State Department sanctions or designations, which are more political in nature. All possibilities are still open, however. Any bank that does not adhere to compliance regulations, that does not adhere to the mechanisms and procedures that have been put in place by the FTO, and are not careful about the risks, will be at risk of being sanctioned. The situation in Yemen is very complex, and banks need to be very keen and more focused on ensuring that all of their transactions are above board. And the banks themselves come at the forefront of this supervision. With regards to the money exchange companies, after moving the banks from Sana'a to Aden, we will start moving the major money exchange companies and money transfer companies to Aden, those that still have access to the Western Union and MoneyGram networks. It's important for them to move to Aden, for them to be under the spotlight, to ensure that all of their transactions and activities are in line with international regulations concerning money laundering and terrorism financing, as well as that they are in adherence to the FTO designation. Thank you very much, Ahmed. The final question before concluding this session is a question from Michelle Hampton. I hope I pronounced your name well. And her question is,
would he like to see from the international community إيش الذي أنت حابب
what would you like to
تشوفه
see from the international community,
خصوصا الاتحاد الأوروبي
and more particular the European Union, in support of the Central Bank of Yemen and the government of Yemen? Thank you very much for this question. I think it's a very important question, maybe the most important question. in our webinar today. The European Union, we have a very strong relationship. The most recent visit, we had a visit from all of the ambassadors not too long ago. And we are in regular consultation and cooperation with the EU on many issues. And their advice and consultations are also very important to us. But during this period, I hope that the EU can continue and expand its support to Yemen, especially support in capacity building for state institutions and helping ensure that the Yemeni banking sector, when compliant, is able to have access to European and international banks, and also supporting the central bank so that it can help provide assistance to banks that face liquidity problems so that the banking sector as a whole does not collapse. And there would need to be a transitional period, a period where banks shift from Sana'a to Aden. And if the EU is unable to provide this directly to the government of Yemen, the EU can also recommend this to other donors and through other mechanisms. And this support will be very valuable. The EU has always been one of the biggest supporters of Yemen and the central bank. The EU has been an important partner in many of the difficult periods that we have gone through. The relationship is a very strong one, and we hope that it can be expanded and bolstered. Thank you very much, Ahmed. Unfortunately, because we've gone over time, I will give a bit of time to Khaled if he has any additional comments or concluding remarks, as well as Your Excellency, the Governor. I'll come back to you. Over to you, Khaled. Thank you very much. The objective, at the end of the day, the objective of this session was to better understand what steps could be taken to protect the banking sector in Yemen as an important sector that serves all of the country as a whole. And I had several points that I wanted to make on that. The first is to the government of Yemen. The government of Yemen, the banks are facing a sharp liquidity crisis in Yemeni riyals and in US dollars, especially in the area under the control of the Houthis, where most of banking clients reside. Banks need the Central Bank of Yemen to take steps to allocate or provide them with their frozen balances and to start repayments on the treasury bills and bonds that they invested in, and also to help overcome the challenges facing the cash cycle in the country. The government and the central bank can ensure that all public spending goes through commercial banks. This could include the payment of salaries for civilians and military personnel, as well as all of the public spending from the central bank. Another point is that the exchange rate continues to be a problem for banks. And this is something that requires monetary and financial policies to be unified, because these policies were conflicting in the previous period, to help ensure that we will not continue to use inflationary spending to cover for any deficits. And the third point is that there's an almost full absence for the government in dealing with the designation and the sanctions in a way that would serve or help ensure that they do not have a negative impact on civilians. There should have been a committee formed with representatives from the Ministry of Finance, from the Ministry of Justice, from the Central Bank, etc., to help mitigate any negative impact of the designation on civilians. And the next recommendation is to the areas under the control of the Houthis to maintain the banking sector. To ensure its survival, they need to fully withdraw from any interference in the sector. And the next recommendation is for banks. It is important for banks to invest more and more in compliance and also invest in electronic services for the sake of transparency and compliance. Thank you very much, Khaled. Ahmed, Your Excellency, back to you. Thank you very much, Noha. I think Khaled has made some excellent recommendations. Some of these recommendations can be adopted by us at the Central Bank, and we hope that the higher authorities in the countries are responsive to them. We had a meeting today in the Crisis Committee of the Government of Yemen, and this is one of the issues that were discussed with regards to forming a committee. We made this proposal 3 or 4 months ago. And also as a part of the process of forming the imports committee that I spoke about. For the banks, we've also provided several initiatives to them that banks should help in covering their debts, especially the deposits of civilians in the areas under the control of the government or the liberated areas, so that the banks are able to make their transition to Aden as smooth as possible. Also, the proposal of the proposal regarding the cash cycle through banks, we tried to do this through the auctions when we had the external funding to try to finance the banks that were covering or providing credits for imports, so that Yemeni riyals would be deposited in the banks and we could deposit foreign currency in the bank's accounts abroad. And we were successful, relatively successful in this, but unfortunately, all of the funds that were available for the actions were completed. Also, with regards to the payment of salaries, there are some problems that have hindered some compliance, but there continues to be insistence that this issue, the issue of the payment of salaries and ensuring that spending will be done through accounts in the commercial banks, and every person can then select the bank that they would like to receive the payments from, whether a commercial bank, a government bank, or an Islamic bank. And so I thank Khaled for his recommendations. And my final point, if we have anyone from Sana'a here, anyone who is in touch with those in power there, we ask you, please keep the situation that civilians are in, that the banking sector is in mind. This is something that we as Yemenis have built and accumulated over decades, and it cannot be destroyed. There were significant efforts made. We've lost all of Yemen's infrastructure. We've lost our airline. We've lost everything. The only thing that we have is the bare minimum, and that is the banking sector, which is still trying to operate and still trying to maintain and provide services to civilians. And so we ask them to take that into account and to do this in service of all Yemenis. On our end, as the central bank, we do not intend to escalate. We do not intend to further complicate the situation. We do not want to exploit these developments. Our only concern is to ensure that banks can continue to operate. This is the only thing that remains out of all of the pillars of the Yemeni economy. Everything else has been destroyed. Our industrial base has been destroyed. Even the facilities, whether airports or ports or everything has been destroyed. The only thing that remains are these banks. And even though they are paralyzed, we need them to survive. And so stay out of this sector so that they do not come under any further problems. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Governor Ahmed Ghaleb, and thank you very much, Khaled Mansour, for your time. I think a conclusion it would be difficult to find a conclusion for this session. I know that we were not very optimistic and that the situation was also very unclear. The situation at the regional level continues to be unstable and chaotic, as well as the local level. Thank you very much for your efforts, Ahmed, and trying to ensure the survival of this very vital sector. Our session today was I believe was very useful for our audience or anyone watching the live broadcast. Thank you for your very clear recommendations, as well as your requests for support for the central bank. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you to our audience. We apologize for not being able to answer all of the questions. Unfortunately, we did not have enough time, but we will have additional sessions hopefully in the future with Mr. Ahmed Ghaleb, and we hope that we will be able to host them for further discussions. Thank you very much again. I fully understand how busy you are. I fully understand how much is on your plate, but thank you for being here, and hopefully we can see you in the next webinar. Have a great day.